Good Sunday morning. I'm Jaden Jefferson, and welcome to this week's Community Focus. I'm right now joined by Matt Foss of the University of Toledo, and we're right now talking about the ongoing strikes that are happening in Hollywood. So thanks for joining me.
My pleasure, Jaden.
So let's first talk about why this is happening, because there are two that are happening simultaneously. You have the writer's strike, and then you also have the actors' strike. So what's going on?
Yeah, so as in most industries, workers have to collectively bargain or join together so that they can be franchised because of a tradition of their work or means of production being exploited. And sometimes that's very difficult when your work is creative or artistic. And so, like the people who work up on the Jeep line or up on Dearborn on the Ford line, uh, artists, somewhat late in the game, somewhat late in the history of organized labor, have unionized or organized to be a collective bargaining unit. The major unions that are tied to the film and television industry are the DGA, the Directors Guild of America, SAG-AFTRA, which is the Screen Actors Guild, which joined with the Association of Film, Television, Radio, Video Artists, I believe it is. There's a stage acting called Actors Equity that takes care of stage acting and stage managers. There's a writers guild named the WGA, and that's a little complicated. There's a WGA East and WGA West, and you're a member depending on where you live in the country. If you are east of the Mississippi, like I am, you're a member of WGA East. If you are west of the Mississippi, WGA West. And then and then the people who work on the crews are often IATSE, which is a wide-ranging union that covers everything from stagehands on Broadway shows to stunt performers to technicians, like a lot of the visual effects artists who are unionizing for Marvel currently will most likely join IATSE. And it can be more complicated that like a lot of animation writers are in either the Animation Guild, which is under an IATSE contract, which can be really complicated. But the Writers Guild, which I'm a member of, first organized in the 1950s, 1960s, and struck and fought so that there would be compensated for their work every time that it was screened on a screen, and as television and new technology, fighting for the protection of their work. And this is the longest strike in the history of the film industry, longer than 2007's strike. So a lot of people know, like, The Office wasn't around for a long time because that was on strike. And that was a big watershed because technology and streaming was just starting to come into the market, but what that business model is still wasn't figured out. And in a lot of reasons, a lot of means, it still hasn't been figured out because Silicon Valley has moved into Southern California and brought in this business model that has thrown away years of sustainable and profitable business models in this kind of growth model that's unproven, and then hidden the data that's different than the Nielsen ratings for your regular television, hidden the data of how much people are truly watching on Netflix or Amazon Prime or Hulu.
And I think for people that were around for that strike back all those years ago, not that long ago, but you could obviously see that it was a different time because unscripted things were gaining popularity because we didn't see shows that involved writers due to the strike. And I think late night television, I guess, is the biggest example of that. You saw
Mm-hmm.
people like Conan who were doing things unscripted, but now the networks aren't even attempting that. We've just seen reruns.
Yeah, and it's because in a lot of ways, there was a golden era of television that started before that strike with the rise of The Sopranos and these prestige shows on HBO. And but there's been lots of incredible work. In a lot of ways, television, which used to be a place where movie stars went to die, is now become a place where people are really committed to the work, and they're pumping considerable resources into the writers, performers, directors, and producers. And there's been exponential, or in many ways, exponentially K-shaped growth as CEOs and stock prices have gone up. Compensation packages for CEOs and stock prices have gone up, while compensation for writers and actors has gone down, down, down. And people, the majority of America is really with the strike, despite not knowing or maybe having some really major preconceptions that writers live a really affluent lifestyle. But when you start to see the accounting, it's not even middle class. Like most of them, showrunners for many of the most popular shows you may be watching on Netflix, Hulu, Disney Plus, are having to drive Lyft just to make ends meet, because rather than 22 episodes of ad-supported network television like This Is Us or The Office, you may get 10 episodes, and they're trying to write those rather than having 6 to 12 writers in a room working on that. Try to have 4 writers write everything in 4 weeks, and then 1 writer in charge of it for the remainder of the production. And then equally, where you get paid each time an episode show. It's really interesting right now. There's a resurgence of the old show Suits on Netflix, one of the most popular shows on Netflix right now. And the people who wrote that show are showing their residuals, and they are making sense, despite the Netflix talking about millions of hours of watching. They're making pennies. And so the accounting practices, if you look at some of our biggest blockbuster TV shows or films, because of some shady accounting, Hollywood claims that these are all failures. So despite how much money they promote at the box office, they're able to charge themselves enough money so that they don't have to pay a share of the profits. Like the writer director of Men in Black was supposed to get a share of box office profits, and he's never seen a dime of it, despite the popularity of that multi-film franchise. They've claimed that it was a financial disaster.
One thing I'm really glad you brought up with regard to this writer's strike was the fact that people often assume just because people work in Hollywood, they're in the industry, that they're living an affluent life. And I think that was definitely true when people saw the actors' strike begin, because they assumed, well, if you're making $1 million off of a movie, we're not talking about the Tom Hanks, the Meryl Streeps of the world. We're talking about working actors, people that have these different gigs,
For sure.
this dream that they're pursuing. So
sure, and that high percentage of them, the high percentage of them are not making 6 figures. They're lucky to be making 20 to 30,000 and to be able to get their insurance as actors or writers, and particularly threatened with the companies who Stoneface said, we are not going to negotiate on things like AI to scan your face and use it in perpetuity. So really, really complicated ways for people who are trying to make their living.
And there was this interesting remark. Disney CEO Bob Iger has said a lot of things during the strike. And I know some things that shareholders are probably saying, hush. And then you have viewers that are like, what? So you really do have this interesting dynamic here. But one of the things he said was he was talking about linear television and how that may not be core to Disney's business. And then he said that the demands were unreasonable during this time. So for someone like Disney CEO, what is happening right now? Because it's almost like I'd rather see the company tank than offer what some of these people are asking for.
That's a great question, Jaden. You know, the AMTP, which is the organizing for all these large, so it's not the companies that have the cool logos for the movies for the most part, but it's Disney, Amazon, Netflix, Sony, Apple, Warner's. They've had a bad run. They've decided to pick a fight with people who get paid to craft narrative and tell story. And the story they've been telling has not really been working, about leaking news that that they're going to wait till people start losing their apartments or their houses. And most of the time, both Mr. Iger and Mr. Zaslav had to walk back their comments pretty quickly. And it seems that they might have been learning their lessons somewhat, because they're both sides are honoring the media blackout, particularly the AMTP right now, as they're currently at the negotiating table. What Mr. Iger is saying about linear television is disproven by even like the Taylor Sheridan Yellowstone shows, and the reason that they're putting 1923 and 1883 on CBS this fall. And the reason that so many of our streaming platforms are going to uh, AVOD, ad supported video on demand, or you pay a premium to get rid of those ads, which is really almost going back to what things were in the 90s and early 2000s in terms of cable. What Mr. It is confusing what Mr. Iger wants. My belief is that they're working to try to spin off ABC and ESPN and potentially Hulu, so that Iger can broker a sale to Apple, who has more money than anyone and is probably desperate. Not desperate, but heavily interested. I don't think Apple's desperate for anything, but are interested in buying all that IP and all that catalog. And I think Iger is, from what I've heard in the union, and the more conciliatory things he's saying, it is looking for. It seems that the heads at CEO are probably the most proactive in trying to find a resolution, and some of these bigger players are starting to step in line. And I think I will not be surprised if we see Apple in the next. I don't think within the next year, but soon, somehow trying to make a purchase of Disney, with Iger working towards that deal.
And it's really interesting because you would think that when you have something that's working, you wouldn't want to change it. But the most interesting fact about all of this is the fact that all of the ABC stations that Disney does own in all of these big cities, they're number one.
There's a lot of people who are in charge of these companies are not storytellers, but are coming from Silicon Valley, where if you look, I mean, and writers are telling those stories, this about Elizabeth Smart, or like Theranos and these type of things, where it's all about go, 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 grow, and not about efficiency or effectiveness or even quality. It's just about growth. And so think about how many shows have been made, and how there's so many shows that there's probably going to be a contraction of material that's generated. And hopefully some of these studio heads and CEOs will stop chasing trends, and even calling what we try to make content, and try to actually create stories, because viewership is out there. People are still craving stories. You can see it. They thought they proclaimed the movie theater dead, and we can see even what's going through Barbenheimer right now, and Mission Impossible, or last year's Maverick, in Top Gun Maverick. People will go see these movies, and they may get a little tired of seeing the same factory made shows. As much as I love Marvel, I'm really behind and kind of saturated, or overwhelmed. And so they're showing that people are interested in original stories, and that's become a big bargaining point for the strike, because AI is not generative; it's synthetic. It scrapes information and puts it together, and it's going to be a rehashing of existing stories, as opposed to generating new ones.
And I definitely think we've all had that moment on a streaming service where we're looking for something, you can't find it, and you're definitely in that place where consolidation's kind of killing that, because we have companies like Warner Media and Disney that they're just very consolidated, and you're going to continue to get the things that you've been getting without the fact that there are things people want out there. So in terms of where you see these strikes going, obviously they're continuing, and their chances are they're going to go a long time. So
Yeah.
you see the end of the road for these strikes anytime soon?
It was disappointing that the DGA, the Directors Guild, signed their agreement so early. I think because there's a real tipping point going on, is that with the overwhelming support during the strike authorization votes from both SAG and the WGA, and with the upcoming deals for IATSE, and I think the unionization of special effects, there's a real watershed or tipping point that we're onto. The fact we get weekly emails from our strike captains, and the strategy seems to have been working, and the emails have kind of slowed down. They said they're going back and forth, and both groups are making negotiations. The writers will go first because typically the writers have been the most they've the WGA has authorized and went on strike the most. Often because their relationship with producers, if you see like old movies like The Player or the Barton Fink, it's always probably been contentious. Maybe Mank on Netflix is a good example of almost a genetic strife between studios and writers because you can make a bad movie out of a good script, but you can't make a good movie out of a bad script, and they know that. I think that it sounds like some of the biggest hurdles right now is figuring out staffing minimums and protections for the duration of your contract, because they've been trying to push everything down into these short-term mini rooms that are making it impossible for people to stay employed. They are like Netflix. You might get a really large sum of money, and by large, it's large for people who are making pennies. So it might be 35,000 for a first draft, which is can be a large check. But when you have to pay for your manager, your lawyer, and your agent, that's almost 25 to 35% of that check before taxes to someone else that helps negotiate and get you that work. And so I think the staffing minimums will probably be the largest sticking point. It seems that AI, particularly with the most recent Supreme Court decision, I think the reading is, I think people are starting to slow down, and I think that SAG and WGA will get what they need on AI, and then an increase on those minimum protections. There's kind of a ladder depending on what you're doing. So we just shot a micro budget feature in Detroit or in Toledo last spring, and it was pre-strike, and it was on a SAG WGA micro budget agreement where we made it was more expensive to pay my dues. Like I didn't get paid on it. And so they'll work with you to make union supported work and give you those supports. And so if they have those kind of sliding scales so that you can make your own work, but I think they're trying to increase those minimums that don't reflect not only our current inflation but the cost of living since 2007 or beyond.
I'm not a financial expert by any means, but it's almost like rapid growth and consolidating isn't good for business. I don't know. I'm no expert here, but
yeah, it is complicated. I mean, anyone trying to navigate the Max app, yeah, and just how confounding it is that where you see, Gold Rush next to The Sopranos is a very confusing experience. I mean, I wouldn't be shocked if we start seeing streaming services coming bundle and really just start to look again like cable, just without cable,
yeah.
like on-demand cable here very soon.
I've been telling people with the amount of streaming services we're paying for at this point, we're paying for cable. So it seems like what's old is new again. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing in this industry.
Yeah, and there's a lot of truth telling to the powers that be that they've abandoned these models in the sake of novelty, and then they're trying to tell us that the models that used to work are novel, are new, and people aren't buying it. And the biggest thing about this model is that the former model was lucrative and successful and worked. It was efficient. People made shows. They knew how to make shows, and people made profits. But right now, the profits are only going in one direction. They're not letting, and people aren't learning how to make shows because they're being starved out of the process. And now that they're wanting to go back to this old model, no one's saying I told you so, but they are saying we need to have a frank conversation about what is happening and what hasn't happened. And it does sound through the back channels that they'll find something like the Nielsen rating that made advertising and viewership numbers transparent to everyone. There's going to find some way that will consolidate information across the streaming platforms.
For sure. And one way I like to close out these segments is looking ahead. And from what we're hearing now and what we're already starting to see is a viewer strike next.
It could be like, I mean, the view, viewing numbers, a hit show now, think of back like a show like Freaks and Geeks. If Freaks and Geeks got that viewership now, it would be a hit on Netflix. Uh, um, where it was the lowest rated television show on NBC, or maybe all of TV when it came out that first season. So viewership numbers, it's tough to tell because I think there's a paradigm shift coming because of the proliferation of shows. To be a hit, you don't have to have the size, and there's very few huge kind of zeitgeist hits right now. Like some people might say Yellowstone was the only one, but it's in trouble right now with all the inner strife, and Mr. Sheridan hasn't done a great job in the press in terms of talking about what he's doing or hasn't been doing. But it is true that when people have options to watch, they'll vote with their feet, or in this case, their remotes. And I think you'll start to see. I think this is true really with Sony, with how they have not gone into streaming and they've focused on movie theaters and traditional box office, and it's working for them with their Spider-Mans, and it's working. You see Apple winning Oscars compared to Netflix. Like they have a model and it's working. Netflix and even like Amazon Prime's just kind of spending money is not necessarily working. And so I think there may not be a viewership strike, but I think people will vote, or so the supply and demand is probably going to move. The supply is going to shrink because the demand has changed, and particularly during COVID, where people relied on stories to feel connected, I think audiences' literacy and taste and desire to engage with story, particularly as phones have diluted interactions and made everything so short and clipped and single serving, that when you can tell a story incredibly well told, people will crave that. And you see that coming out particularly in the box office right now, and when these hit shows really catch on. Think of like a Ted Lasso or Mandalorian. We'll see what Ahsoka is like when it comes out, but these shows become really big hits, and the numbers are different than the last episode of MASH, but I think that audiences are taking bigger risks and trying new things. I do think that we'll stop seeing as many binge shows where they release all the episodes at one time and lean into like the success of how Succession, and Last of Us built that snowball effect. It improves your storytelling, it improves the relationship with your audience and your viewers, and I think people will rely on that more and more.
And I'm glad that there are still some people out there that believe that people will come for a good story, even though CEOs that are paid millions of dollars to deliver those results may not get it yet, but we'll get there. Matt Foss, Associate Professor of Theater at the University of Toledo, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Jaden.
Thank you. I appreciate it.